Call this meeting to order. So welcome to meeting number 75 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. Pursuant to the order of reference of Friday, November 25th, 2022, the committee continues consideration of Bill C-20, an act establishing the Public Complaints and Review Commission and amending certain acts and statutory instruments. Today, the committee starts clause by clause consideration. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. Pursuant to the standing orders, members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Although this room is equipped with powerful audio system, feedback events can occur. These can be extremely harmful to interpreters and cause serious injuries. The most common cause of sound feedback is an earpiece worn too close to a microphone. We therefore ask all participants to exercise a high degree of caution when handling the earpieces, especially when your microphone or your neighbor's microphone is turned on. Invite participants to ensure that they speak into the microphone into which their headset is plugged in, and to avoid manipulating the earbuds by placing them on a table away from the microphone when they're not in use. A reminder that all comments should be addressed to the chair. I'd like to thank all the officials who are joining us once again. I appreciate your patience. I'd also like to thank Mr. Shipley for presiding over the previous meeting. I understand it was a trial by fire, and he came out very well.
There was no applause from over there.
There you go.
I tried.
And before we introduce the officials, I understand Ms. O'Connell, you wish the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I provided notice of motion. I'd like to move it now. I move that the committee hold a meeting immediately after the committee study of Bill C-20 on the rights of victims of crime and the security reclassification and transfer of offenders within federal corrections, that the committee invite the Commissioner of Correctional Service Canada, Ann Kelly, the Deputy Minister of Public Safety, Sean Tupper, and the correctional investigator, the Federal Ombudsman for Victims of Crime, Tim Danson, and officials from the Department of Justice and Public Safety. And Mr. Chair, now that that's in the record, I'd like to speak briefly on this. It's been, 4 meetings that we've attempted to address the issue of dealing with reclassification of prisoners. We've had many sidebar conversations. We've had many committee discussions with amendments. The motion that we have introduced here today takes into account all of the concerns that have been raised, including the issues around including the lawyer representing victims. And yet the Conservatives continue to play games with heinous crimes against women. And Mr. Chair, it's incredibly disappointing to see, but I'm sure Conservatives saw over the course of last week similar correspondence that we received, including from several women absolutely appalled that such a heinous crime is being used as a filibuster tool to avoid dealing with C-20, which many have pointed out is something that many survivors of sexual harassment and victimization say is a welcome tool that we need to be moving on with. So this is a motion in good faith to take into account all of the concerns from multiple parties about what they would like to see happen in terms of this study so that we can move forward with C-20 and the work of this committee. Now, if members opposite, if Conservatives decide to filibuster using this issue, women will be the judge of their issues and who is actually fighting for real legislation that will have an impact versus using heinous crimes as a way to create clickbait. I saw some members out there filming their videos already. Perhaps it's to hit their fundraising targets. I don't know. I guess we'll see. But I think women in this country would be appalled to see that sort of behavior. As I mentioned, the committee has received correspondence on this very matter about the performance of many at the meetings previously. I know we've received several pieces of correspondence. I know I have, I'm sure others have, about how appalling it was that some members at the last meeting, when we're talking about such an important issue, all male colleagues on the Conservative side decided to talk over the women speaking on this committee, more concerned about the score of the Blue Jay game. And, you know, women notice these things. So if we are serious about having a conversation about how prisoner classification is handled in this country, if we're serious about victims' rights, then we can move forward on this motion and move forward with having that meeting. And if it's up to the Conservatives now, I think, if there are other members from other parties, I don't pretend to speak for them, but I do believe this is a motion to address the very issues about discussing prisoner transfers and reclassifications, and has, like I said, addressed all of the issues that have been raised to us. So if this really isn't a filibuster using heinous crimes against women, then Conservatives can prove it by voting for this motion and moving forward with C-20. If they choose not to do that, then, like I said, I think women in this country realize that crimes against them are nothing more than political tools for the Conservatives to block legislation. I think that's incredibly sad, and also probably why Conservatives are polling so poorly amongst women, because they see through using heinous crimes as political tools. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. O'Connell. We go now to Ms. Rempel-Garner, followed by Mr. Biddle. Go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, and it's a pleasure to work with you both again. It's been a hot minute. I am a woman, and I've been watching what's happened here, and kind of shocked me a little too, to be honest with you, so I'm glad to have an opportunity to speak to this today. I will go to the substance of my colleague's argument for her motion and then try to perhaps propose an alternative. So my colleague said that the motion that she put forward addressed all the concerns of all colleagues. I don't think it does. Some of the issues that have been raised, and I spent yesterday looking through the committee testimony. It was romantic reading, Chair, to be sure. My understanding is that the impasse that we're at in this committee is that some colleagues feel that there should be more meetings, particularly to give victims an opportunity to talk about the impact from their perspective. I also don't think that there has been an opportunity for correctional services officers, particularly the union, to give their feedback on whether or not the measures the government has put in place are adequate. So this is what I propose, and then I'd like to give my rationale with respect for what I'm proposing. So I move to amend the motion such that all the words after the word "that" be replaced with the following. And Chair, I will ensure that this is circulated in both official languages to you, particularly for my colleague in the block. So I move that all the words after the word "that" be replaced with the following. The committee hold a minimum of 3 meetings immediately after the committee's study of Bill C-20 on Paul Bernardo's transfer from a maximum security prison to a medium security prison, the rights of victims of crime and the security reclassification and transfer of offenders within federal corrections, provided that the committee invite the Minister of Public Safety to appear alone for no less than 2 hours, and the former Minister of Public Safety, Marco Mendicino, to appear alone for no less than 2 hours, the Commissioner of Correctional Services Canada, Ann Kelly, the Deputy Minister of Public Safety, Sean Tupper, the Correctional Investigator, the Federal Ombudsperson for Victims of Crime, and the representatives of the victim's family, including Tim Danson, and that the committee report its findings to the House. So I would like to give an argument why I think this is in the best interest, I hope I can give fresh voice to this. So I wrote an article on this morning, and I entitled it, "Canada has a re-victimization problem, but doesn't want to find out why." So last June, an uproar arose when the notorious serial rapist and killer Paul Bernardo was transferred to a medium security prison from a maximum security facility. At the time, the families of Bernardo's victims were not given reasons for the transfer. A lawyer for the families, Timothy Danson, described the federal government's opaque process as having a severe re-victimizing effect. As the furor over the transfer unfolded and more details about what happened behind the scenes emerged, it became clear that the federal government had, putting it mildly, been lacking in its oversight of the process and in its consideration for the impact it would have on victims' families. Finger-pointing between Corrections Services Canada, the agency that oversaw the transfer, and the office of the now former Minister of Public Safety, Marco Mendicino, suggested that the minister knew ahead of the transfer but failed to act on the information. These failures are problematic for several reasons, the primary one being that the federal government, led by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, has been found lacking in addressing internal process concerns regarding various high-profile issues, even after major incidents have occurred. For example, the government that oversaw the failures in the Bernardo prison transfer also found itself in the same situation in 2018 when child killer Terry Lynn McClintock was transferred to a minimum security healing lodge. This repetition begs the question, why did the government allow this failure to happen twice, and has the government taken adequate action to ensure that it doesn't happen again? The answer to that question, for me, Chair, remains unclear, despite an internal report on the Bernardo transfer issued during the summer, which I did read in its entirety. The report outlined some startling process gaps that led to the opacity and lack of sensitivity to victims' families, but likely not all, particularly critical errors that occurred within the Office of the Minister of Public Safety. Further, the report largely failed to examine the impact of those issues from testimony directly from the experience of victims' families. In that, it is currently impossible to know if adequate measures have been taken to stop this type of re-victimization, including whether or not a ministerial directive issued to Corrections Services Canada is sufficient. Today, there are very few public details about whether concrete processes have been implemented or whether victims' families feel they are appropriate. The scrutiny for these questions and providing a forum for victims to have their say on the matter would typically fall to members of a parliamentary standing committee. Attempts made by Conservative members of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety to review the issue over the summer were rebuffed by other committee members. And I'll get to that because, yes, there is legislation in front of this committee, but I've also been following this issue. It deeply disturbed me that I had to sit in the House of Commons and listen to the same issue that happened in 2018 happen again. So I was pleased when colleagues tried to get a committee meeting during the summer so that legislation like Bill C-20 would not be held up, that the meeting could have been, this could have been done over the summer. However, that was not done. I'll continue. With Parliament having resumed for the fall sitting, now would seem to be an opportune time to bring the matter forward for study. Unfortunately, the committee has not been able to come to a consensus on whether a study is needed or what witnesses should testify should a committee study be undertaken. The last meeting of the committee saw Liberal Parliamentary Secretary Jennifer O'Connell use procedural tactics to attempt to block the passage of a Conservative motion that would have the Minister of Public Safety appear, ostensibly to testify regarding whether or not the process issues that had occurred in his office around the transfer have been rectified. More importantly, the Conservative motion also called for an opportunity for victims' families to appear to have their say on the impact of the government's process failures and whether or not they felt measures taken to date have been sufficient. Last week, the Conservative Vice Chair of the committee, Doug Shipley, signaled that Conservative members will attempt to pass their motion once again, and here we are. It would seem prudent for the committee to do so, colleagues, given that at least 2 high-profile prison transfer failures have now happened under the current federal government's watch, and others have happened with less public scrutiny. For example, in 2021, the mother of a high-profile murder victim that occurred in Parliamentary Secretary Jennifer O'Connell's riding, Sherry Goberdan, described the re-victimization process that happened when her daughter's murderer, Nicholas Begg, was transferred from a maximum security prison to a medium security facility. There are other issues that must be explored too, like whether or not correctional services staff feel safe. Again, we need to ensure that the union has an opportunity to address this, and I'll get to this in a moment, and protect it under current policy when these types of transfers occur, and also other prisoners who don't have dangerous offender classifications. Parliamentarians may have differing views on how to address the issue of punishment for Canada's most heinous criminals, be it through new legislation or process reform. But it's difficult for Parliament to have that debate if members of governing parties or its supply and confidence partners don't allow the debate to happen to begin with. In that, to prevent more re-victimization, I think that this motion should pass, the revised motion, this sub-amendment. Colleagues, 1 meeting is not adequate for this study. I appreciate that we all might have differing opinions, and I also appreciate that the government might not like to revisit this issue for whatever political reason. But the reality is that there is a pattern now. This is a pattern. This happened with Terry Lynn McClintock. And what happened after that was that the minister who was in charge at the time failed into a really great gig. We now have gone through, I think, 3 public safety ministers, and it happened again. We had to take time in the House of Commons to address this issue, and most importantly, I'll get to the most important part, but when we talk about legislation and the ability to use committee time like this to review legislation, this could have been avoided if the government had taken corrective action in 2018, but they did not. So here we are again. But the most important issue for why this needs more meetings and why we have an onus to review every step of what happened independently and beyond the internal review that happened within the government is because the victims' families were clearly re-traumatized and clearly re-victimized again. Completely unnecessarily. So, to me, that was most striking about what was in the government's internal report, was not just the shocking process gaps that led to the situation, not just that those process gaps existed after Sherry Goberdan went through this, after the family of Tory Lynn Stafford went through this again in 2018, that we were spending more time on it, and that the victims' families had not had an opportunity to talk about the adequacy of the government's review or the government's response. It will take more than 1 meeting. A 1-meeting study on this issue will only allow, and I'm begging colleagues in the opposition parties, a 1-meeting study will only allow the government to put forward some talking points and say everything's okay, but everything's not okay. The legislation that this committee is tasked to review right now, Bill C-20, there are many things that need to be reviewed in it. It's an important piece of legislation, I agree. However, what happened here is now a pattern, and the members of this committee have an onus, a responsibility to the victims' families to hold the government to account, regardless of partisan affiliation. That is what all of our job is here. Outside of those who hold government appointment, the role of us is to hold the government to account. On the report did not address correctional services officers' concerns. This committee and members of this committee have not had the opportunity to scrutinize or ask members of members of that group what the impact of having a maximum security dangerous offender prisoner transferred into a lower level security facility without some sort of a plan. Like what happened in that report, like that poses a security risk to correction services officers for a wide variety of reasons. And I will certainly be reaching out to the union to ensure that if there is not an opportunity for them to testify on that, that they know why. That is just beyond me. So that's number one. I also think that there are many families who have gone through this who need to have their say, because the report did not use a lens of victims, of re-victimization to come up. It was very much an internal review that I think in some ways was navel-gazing. Maybe I'm wrong, but at the end of the day, it's going to take more than 45 minutes of questioning to make that determination, which I hope colleagues would do independently. But I think it's also important for this committee to then ask whether or not the ministerial directive that was issued, and I read that at length too, what steps have actually been implemented out of that? What processes have been implemented? We don't know. The committee doesn't know. And 45 minutes or whatever is left after, a round of departmentals, it's not enough time. It's not enough time for the committee to look at that. I think it needs to be more than 3 meetings to ensure that this doesn't happen again. But I understand that like 3 meetings is kind of the red line minimum for some of my more regular colleagues on this committee. I also want to know what happened in the minister's office, not for political reasons, but I mean, so Correction Services Canada, I believe it was in late June, early July, said that the minister knew about this transfer. At least the minister's office was alerted to this. How was that rectified? And I mean, this has happened twice. It's not just about changing the minister out. With all due respect to my colleague, Mr. Menachino, this is really about parliamentarians looking at whether or not adequate processes and controls exist to ensure that that finger-pointing situation doesn't happen again. And why? Because that traumatizes victims. Paul Bernardo's victims' families should not have had to watch Correction Services Canada point the fingers at the minister's office, the minister's office going, oh, I don't know, maybe I did see the email, maybe I didn't. Like, how is that not going to happen again? And I do not see anything in the ministerial directive that addresses that concern. Or first of all, that outlines what happened. We know something happened. We don't know what happened. And then that needs to be fixed. So, colleagues, this is why, like, if this decision did not involve the minister's office, if there wasn't that back and forth between the minister's office and Correction Services Canada, then okay, perhaps we don't need the minister to testify. I would assume that he would want the opportunity to do so, to have the opportunity to say, okay, this is what happened, and this, don't worry, guys, this is how we're going to do this again, or ensure that this doesn't happen again. I know the current Minister of Public Safety. I would like to think that he would like to fix this problem. We should hear from him on this issue. And we should also hear what happened under the past minister so that he can explain to committee his rationale on how the ministerial directive was implemented and whether or not he thought it was sufficient, so that that can be entered into the committee's report and recommendation to the government, because that's what this study should do, is this study should result in concrete recommendations to the government to ensure that this doesn't happen again. I also think that the reason why we need at minimum three meetings is that we should look at the impact on other situations that have had similar issues, so that I'm sure these families, they want closure. And closure comes in this instance by having a process in place that fixes the problem. But we can't get there if we don't know what the problems are. And it is our duty as parliamentarians to scrutinize the government, to read those reports, to read the ministerial directive, and to ask very technical questions, ask for more information in order to make those recommendations to ensure that that doesn't happen again. I'm not saying I know what those recommendations are, but it's certainly, guys, this is like the fourth, the fifth time, it certainly bears study and it bears our scrutiny. I want to, I respect my colleague across the way, the parliamentary secretary. I do. Her and I respect her knowledge of committee procedure, and I respect her, I respect her knowledge. I want to drive this home personally for her on a case that happened in her article, or in her own writing. So this is the instance of a man who, I believe, stabbed his wife 27 times. The 27-year-old woman was 9 months pregnant when she was stabbed to death in Pickering in 2017. So the mother of this victim, her name was Ariana Goberdan. She was re-victimized when this process failed her too. It is very clear to me that the government has not thought about this, and I would just ask my colleague, parliamentary secretary, to give women like her the opportunity to come to the committee and speak about it. Without getting into more sensitive topics of debate, this was already a difficult case because it involved the stabbing of a woman who was 9 months pregnant. And the mother of the victim did not feel that justice was served, given that I don't believe that the consideration of the death of the fetus I don't believe it was given additional consideration in sentencing, which we did have legislation before the House of Commons earlier this year, which I believe my colleague spoke against. So this was already difficult to begin with. But then it was worse because this person was transferred for a life sentence. This person was transferred from a maximum security prison to a medium security prison, and her only recourse for dealing with this was the media. Can you imagine trying to get through the processing of the death of your daughter and a potential grandchild to be, and then having to go through this without any sort of sensitivity on behalf of Correction Services Canada? So it impacts all of our ridings. I really take offense that, and I did have an interaction with my colleague in the House of Commons in a adjournment proceeding debate. I take offense to the characterization that has happened in these debates over the last few meetings, that this is somehow less important or somehow blocking victims' rights to have this discussion. Because of what these families are going through. You know, Chair, I would just ask that colleagues give their head a shake. So to the substance of the motion, the sub-amendment, perhaps it feels like I will try and persuade my colleagues. So to each of the specific, and Chair, I'm just looking at you. Did you have a copy? You received a copy of the sub-amendment? I'm just wondering if my...
Apparently, but
Okay.
everyone
I'm
got a
looking
copy?
particularly for
In
Ms.
their email?
Michaud, so, okay. So the rationale for having the ministers here, I think I've outlined. So the ministers have to be here to talk about, I think the current minister has to be here to talk about what procedures have been put in place within their office. Correction Services Canada cannot speak to that, right? So the minister has to speak to what processes have been put in place to do things like ensure that the minister reads his email on issues like this, number one. And I would assume that the Minister of Public Safety, the new one, would actually be okay with coming to committee on that. So, like, I think we should have him here for that reason, to be able to articulate what processes have been put in place to rectify the situation. But that, we can't then scrutinize whether or not what he said is adequate unless the former Minister of Public Safety comes in to explain what he believes happened. Now, in reading some of the articles on this issue, he believes that I don't think that he ever said that his staff knew, but Correction Services said that his staff knew, so I think we need to clarify that. That's problematic. Was there any remedial measures that were taken? I want to know who's lying, or perhaps not lying, but like where the people are talking over each other in this situation. Correction Services Canada said that the Minister's office knew. The Minister's office said they did not know. So regardless of prosecuting that point, that situation cannot happen again. So the committee should be asking itself, what processes from the Minister's office perspective are going to be put in place to rectify this? The ministerial directive did not address that anywhere. I'm not sure if colleagues have read the directive, but that is why the ministers need to be there. The ministers need to be there at a minimum. And that's why the sub-amendment needs to pass. My colleague, her original motion did not have the ministers attending, and that is a huge problem in moving forward with this. It really is. The second thing is, I believe that we're going to have a large degree of interest from victim services groups and families. I'm not sure if I'm disclosing anything, but I believe that there is an interest from the representative of the families in this case to have a say publicly on this matter. And the reason why I think that's important is because I do not think the Correction Services Canada or the government has looked at the process through the lens of the victims. So I think that beyond the reason why the motion needs to be broadened to, I'm just looking at the wording here, the rights of victims of crime and the security reclassification and transfer of offenders within federal corrections, is that that process, that victim's lens process, needs to be reviewed from their point of view. And frankly, I think that they're subject matter experts on this in a way that we just aren't, or that Correction Services Canada is not. The ministerial directive states that more can be done to ensure that a trauma-informed and victim-sensitive approach is factored in the decision-making process as regards transfer and security classification. This means meaningfully engaging with victims to elicit input on a transfer prior to its occurrence. What that meaningful engagement means cannot be directed simply by the minister or Correction Services Canada without public scrutiny by this committee. Victims should have the opportunity to stay here and speak and say exactly what that means in terms of operationalization. And then members of this committee should be able to go back to Correction Services Canada or to the government and recommend policy, perhaps additional legislation, changes in procedure, changes in communications, whatever, based on that determination or that testimony. And again, my colleague, with respect to her original motion, it does not have any opportunity for victims to testify. And that's a huge problem. That's who we're here to protect. That's who we should be ensuring that we do not have this perpetual re-victimization process. So 3 hours. Or 3 meetings is what I think needs to happen. I think that I would hope that colleagues, particularly within the opposition parties, would be open to negotiating something on this regard. I also, frankly, the other thing is the direction. I just want to reemphasize this. The direction has nothing in here with regard to Correctional Services Office safety. Nothing. And I feel like they've been perhaps removed from this conversation as well. So perhaps if this amendment does pass, I hope it passes, that colleagues would be open to ensuring that they have a voice as well, too. Colleagues, we probably won't agree on, as parliamentarians, on, again, as I said in the article that I put out this morning, we might not agree on approach to dealing with people like Paul Bernardo. But the debate needs to happen. Again, our responsibility is to hold the government to account, and especially in instances of a pattern. So I think with that, Chair, I would just implore, with deep respect, all of my colleagues to support this amendment. If they have other suggestions on how to deal with this, to do so, not to retract the amount of statements so that this issue is given lip service by the government on talking points, but that it's given the scrutiny that it's deserved by all members of all political parties, and particularly that victims' families are given a say in the matter on determining whether or not ministerial directive, what's happening, is put in place. But guys, the Terry Lynn McClintock thing in 2018, if you didn't have the opportunity to be through that debate, it was deeply uncomfortable. Really uncomfortable. And then to have it happen again, let's make sure it doesn't happen again. Let's have a robust study of this. Could have happened in the summer, but it didn't. So we're sitting here with witnesses sitting here. I get that. But guys, you need 3 meetings. You need to have the victims at the table. You need to have the union at the table. And we need to determine whether or not the process has actually been fixed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rempel-Garner. So the amendment has been distributed. It is noted as a sub-amendment. That's an error. It is an amendment. So the debate continues on the amendment, and we go to Mr. Biddle, followed by Mr. Jennis, followed by Mr. Julian. So Mr. Biddle, go ahead, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I've made my concerns about this known, but I'd like to reiterate it again. Like this case, this offender, whose name I don't even want to mention in this place, it's a painful thing for the people of Niagara. I remember growing up. I remember living through this. It's deeply painful to all the residents, especially the families. And the wishes of the families are of top of mind to me, and I know they are of top of mind to my constituents as well. So I was concerned when members last week, and even a little bit, well, we'll just stick with last week. Members last week were saying, we're speaking on behalf of the families. I interrupted and asked for clarification last week. And I said, I'm curious if it could be answered for us, and if it would shed some light on things, whether anyone has spoken to Mr. Danson or the victims' families. And the answer back, and I'm quoting from Hansard, is yes, they have, from the opposition. So I asked that member to provide me with she said she had letters. Can you provide me with those letters? I didn't hear anything back. And as I'm concerned about the thoughts of the families, I reached out to Mr. Danson, who, Ms. Rempel-Garner is right, is interested in appearing. But no one had reached out to him. And so, multiple meetings of filibuster, saying that we are here for the rights of the family. And using their names, using these tragic circumstances, and not even having the courtesy to reach out. I support Ms. O'Connell's motion. I believe Mr. Danson should be here. Looking at the difference between the amendment and the motion, there's actually less time for victims' representatives to appear in this motion. If it's a 3-meeting study, of which 2 of the meetings are members of Parliament coming to testify, which this committee knows it cannot compel, that leaves a 2-hour study for this. Ms. Rempel-Garner, I believe wholeheartedly her advocacy for victims, and she has been consistent in my 8 years here. And she mentions correctional services and says they've been removed from the conversation. She brought forward and spoke eloquently about how they should be included, but she brought forward a motion that didn't include them. Or an amendment, my apologies, but it was her control to do it, and it was top of mind. It was one of her first points that she spoke to. She told us to give our heads a shake. I direct that back to the Conservative Party, Mr. Chair, that this is painful, that there is consensus amongst the members of this table to hear from Representative Mr. Danson of the French and Mahaffey families, that there is consensus to hear from correctional services, and to have meetings about this and not let it be the filibusters. We have, conservatively 20 government officials sitting here waiting to help us out on legislation to block this. Conservatives say this is important legislation, but the lengthy filibuster using this horrendous act doesn't show it. The point was made clear to me, Mr. Chair, when I walked into this room and a member of the Conservative Party was putting together what I assume is a fundraising video, and smiling as he was showing his assistant the video, as he had his mic set up and ready to go and ready to post it to social media, that this is a game. This is a game for the Conservatives, and it's truly unfortunate. I really do want to hear from Mr. Danson. I believe the families. Maybe we're getting a original clip of that video from the back of the room. I guess they were taking a look at that to see, but I guess we got a brief introduction of that. This committee does need to hear from the family members of the representative, Mr. Danson. It's unfortunate that they choose to not reach out to that family, but to make statements and use them as props. And that is deeply insulting to this place, to the people of Niagara, to use this tragedy to torque for political gain, a tragedy. So this amendment doesn't give the victims' families more opportunity to speak, so I can't support it, and so I'll be voting against it. I hope we can get through to the areas that we do have consensus, and move on and hear about an important piece of legislation and get through that, so that we can then get to the case at hand and hear from these families, because we've agreed on this point, but delay after delay after delay, filibuster after filibuster after filibuster. The Conservatives are just delaying that opportunity for the victims' families to speak. It's almost if they don't want it and would rather just torque and continue to fundraise off it, which is just absolutely disgusting, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Biddle. We go now to Mr. Jennis, followed by Mr. Julian, followed by Mr. Motts. Mr. Jennis, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you for this opportunity to address the motion moved by Ms. O'Connell and the amendment put forward by my colleague. Just maybe a couple words of clarification at the outset. Both Liberal members who spoke have referenced the fact that I was recording a social media post prior to this meeting, and I don't think there's anything wrong with me communicating on a regular basis with my constituents about the things that are happening in committee. Out of interest, it had nothing to do with fundraising. It was a video recorded on a parliamentary device updating my constituents on parliamentary activities, and making very clear in the context of that post that Conservatives will be continuously advocating for families of victims as well as their representatives to be heard on this issue, and there's nothing unusual about our view that that's a legitimate position, the right position, and something that constituents should be aware of. I make no apologies for informing people about my activities in Parliament, and it's sort of curious that became a real talking point latched onto by Liberal members. Respectfully, I would encourage them to be communicating with their constituents as well about the things that they are doing in Parliament, and in this case, frankly, their failure to work to include the voices of victims in this conversation. In particular, Chair, we are, I guess, seized with this comparison between the motion that Ms. O'Connell has put forward and the amendment that my colleague has put forward. And I think a couple observations about this are important. One is Mr. Biddle suggested that our motion provided less time to hear from people about this issue. On the face of it, that's obviously false, because the original motion says that the committee hold a meeting, one meeting, and it. I'm sorry, but if you want to provide a clarification
Point of order,
informally,
Mr. Chair. We can,
Mr. Biddle on a point of order.
if we can direct Mr. Genuis not to yell into the mics, the interpreters don't need to hear. He's quite loud enough, and it's not a problem for me either in terms of volume of voice.
Thanks for the point.
I don't think I was yelling, but I can speak even more softly if that would be preferred by Mr. Biddle. The motion that Mr. Biddle put forward says a meeting, which I believe means one meeting and only meeting, and it in fact constrains the committee.
A little confused. Mr. Biddle did not put forward a motion.
I'm sorry. I misspoke, Chair. The motion from his side, from the government side, that Mr. Biddle defended. Mr. Biddle defended it by saying that it allowed for more discussion of the issue, in fact, than the amended version. Mr. Biddle's argument is incorrect, because the motion put forward by his colleague, Ms. O'Connell, references a meeting, one meeting. I will note that the amendment that Conservatives have put forward calls for a minimum of 3 meetings. So if Mr. Biddle is actually authentically concerned about the fact that our motion doesn't provide for enough time for consideration of this issue, we could, of course, consider a sub-amendment that would have a minimum of 4 meetings or 5 meetings. I don't think that would be objectionable to members on the side. But it does say a minimum of 3 meetings, which I think provides opportunity for the committee to go further down this road if the committee wishes to. So it is bald-faced fabrication to suggest that the amendment provides less time for consideration of this issue, and I think a fairly obvious and easily verifiable fabrication. It's evident in the first line, the first phrase of both, that the committee hold a meeting is replaced with the committee hold a minimum of 3 meetings. Minimum of 3
Mr.
meetings.
Genuis?
Now, yes, Chair.
I would advise not to use the word fabrication here. That implies dishonesty, and we are expected to assume that everyone is speaking honestly. We cannot
All right,
do indirectly what we cannot do directly.
Thank you, Chair. That is a more challenging assumption in some cases than in others, but I will endeavor to submit to your authority in this as well as all things. The no doubt unintentional misstatement of Mr. Biddle has been no doubt addressed. I also want to identify. I'm sorry, Ms. O'Connell maybe has a point of order, or maybe is just heckling. Thank you. This actually brings me to
let's avoid crosstalk here, please, people.
Yeah, this actually brings to another point. Ms. O'Connell said that at the last meeting, the Conservative contingent at the table was all male. That I won't say it was a fabrication, but anyone consulting the record will know that there were female Conservative MPs
Point of
that
order, Mr.
spoke
Chair.
on the record. And
Ms. O'Connell on a point of order.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. What I said, and to clarify the record, that I said
This
was
doesn't sound like a
only
point of
male
order.
voices, once again, interrupting when I had the floor. That's what I said, and the member opposite just proved my point in real time.
Just
Thank you for the
on that point of
clarification.
order, Chair, that was not a point of order.
Wait
And
till I address you, please. So thank you for the point of order. Mr. Janice on that point of order.
yeah, Mr. Chair, I think you will find respectfully that that was not a point of order, and Ms. O'Connell, I think, knows the rules and is using points of order to try to inject substantive, well, not that substantive, but somewhat substantive arguments. I wonder if
I
wonder
did
if you
not
could-
find that was not a point of order. You may.
that was a
may
point of
continue.
order. Chair, can you think it's a point of order when the member says, I want to interject and clarify my opinion on a subject?
I think we're going off topic here. Let's.
Well, no,
why don't you
Chair.
go
Chair,
back to
you're the
your
chair.
debate?
So what's your ruling that members can raise points of order where they express opinions on matters and don't even pretend that they're raising issues of order? I mean, issues of order are issues about the rules of the committee. And the member said, I have a point of order, and said, just to clarify, here's what I said previously.
Mr. Janice, my point is that the chair will make a determination if whether or not it's a point of order, not you. I'm content that it was a satisfactory clarification. It's good for the committee to clarify these matters. If you wish to carry on this point of order, do so. Otherwise, please carry on with your debate.
Chair, I'm new to this committee, so I just find it helpful to understand your interpretation of the rules. It sounds like when another member is speaking, I could also say, point of order, I want to clarify my previous statement or my opinion on such and such a subject, and you would deem that to be a legitimate point to raise. Is that your interpretation of
I
the
have
rule?
seen this happen from both sides on a frequent basis. So I think on balance, it is a fair point. Whether or not it's a point of order or a point of information, I don't know. But please carry on with your debate.
Okay, maybe the clerk can clarify if point of information is actually a real thing or is anywhere in the rules. I think, and I'll maybe I'll let you come back to the committee on that. Yeah, I do. I'm happy to carry on, but a point of information.
I do have an actual point of order that I'm going to reference.
Ms. Rempel-Garner on a point of order.
Thank you. I'll reference House of Commons procedure and practice, and it's on decorum. Chair may usually overlook many incidental interruptions, such as applause, shouts of approval, disapproval, or mild heckling that sometimes punctuate speeches as long as disorder does not arise. Colleagues, we do have a code of conduct now that governs how we govern ourselves in these committees, and I would argue, Chair, that the repeated heckling of Ms. O'Connell it doesn't bother me. I mean, girl, I've seen it all. But I do think that it is adding to this disorder of the committee at present, and I think it is taking my colleagues' train of thought off. So I would just ask, Chair, that you encourage people to listen to colleagues' arguments, which they may or may not agree with. We do have a speaking order, and perhaps stop the heckling, which is designed on a point of order on decorum. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Rempel-Garner. Mr. Janice, do you wish to proceed?
Yes, Chair, I do. Thank you. I'll return to the point of arguments and maybe allow you to review some of the rules around these matters of order subsequent to the subsequent to the meeting. But Chair, I wanted to just return to the point I had been at before being interrupted by members opposite, which was to address the issues around the differences between the original motion put forward by Ms. O'Connell and the revised and the amended version proposed by Ms. Rempel-Garner. One thing that I think should jump out is the fact that there is no reference to ministers responsible in the government motion. The government motion wants to hear from various officials, including the Deputy Minister of Public Safety. And the Conservative motion seeks to follow the logical train of ministerial accountability and have the minister responsible at present for this file, as well as the ministers responsible at the time present before the committee. I do think it is important that we hear from the correct point of accountability. I've been here for about 8 years, and I've sort of noticed this trajectory at committee where when there are issues or problems, even issues or problems that do involve legitimate political accountability, they're not just questions of public administration, but they're issues that should have been and were brought to the attention of ministers that involve questions of government policy. The impulse still is on the government side to have officials come and provide testimony. I think officials providing testimony is extremely useful in certain kinds of contexts. We have officials here for possible consideration on clause-by-clause stage of a bill, but their role is to provide that kind of technical expertise and information. But we should not allow ourselves to mistake that role of providing sort of technical context with the responsibility of ministers to provide to be the ones ultimately accountable for decisions of their department. That's how our system works. It's based on the principle of ministerial accountability. And when officials are put in a position to testify, when in fact it should be ministers testifying, I think frankly, it's unfair to those officials because they are career public servants, they're experts, and they will faithfully implement government policy regardless of the stripe of that government, and may at some point in the future be called on to implement different policies of a different government, and yet they are increasingly being brought to committees at the impetus of government members, kind of in place of what should be testimony provided by ministers. And I think this is kind of a further erosion of the principle of ministerial accountability. And look, in this issue of the transfer of this heinous offender, Paul Bernardo, from maximum to medium security, I think there are legitimate and important questions we have to ask about ministerial accountability. And I think we see sort of at a broad level that the government is embarrassed about this issue. They don't want people to be talking about this issue. They don't want people to be doing posts and speaking with the public about this issue because they're embarrassed by it. But in particular, they don't want to have ministers come before the committee, clarify what ministers knew, what decisions ministers made, and to really take responsibility for the fact that Canadians don't elect officials, nor should they. Canadians elect the minister. They elect parliamentarians, and through a process we all understand, we have ministers that are elected members of the House of Commons in virtually all cases, and they have that political responsibility for decisions that are made, and by extension, they have to take responsibility for actions and decisions of their whole department. And so, this is why it is proper that we have ministers that come before the committee and provide that context. In that light, I do want to share this article from June about the former minister that notes, in fact, the involvement of the minister's office. It's an article from CBC which says staff in Mendicino's office knew about Bernardo's transfer months before minister did. His office says. And just before I get into this article, I wanted to respond to something Mr. Biddle said earlier. He sort of casually referenced when it comes to the issue of calling ministers. He sort of casually referenced, well, clearly a committee can't compel members of Parliament to appear before a committee and provide testimony. That is, of course, accurate. Members of Parliament cannot be compelled to testify before parliamentary committees. But I certainly don't understand or wouldn't defend this sort of casual disregard for the importance of inviting people, even if they can't be compelled. Most of the committees I've been a part of, it is the normal practice to invite a good many people who, if they choose not to appear, the committee doesn't compel. In some cases, because they can't compel. In some cases, they choose not to. The committee choosing to use the power to compel witnesses who are not parliamentarians is still a power that committees use relatively rarely. So the idea that we would not pass a motion seeking to hear from witnesses simply because we could not subsequently compel those witnesses doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, my hope would be that that proposing that motion provides enough of an impetus to encourage those people to testify. And I hope the Minister of Public Safety, as well as the former minister, would, in response to the request from this committee, understand the importance of the issues that are associated with it and be willing to testify. Again, because government members are resisting this push, it suggests that there is a certain reluctance there. But I would hope that we could get to the point of extending the invitation, providing that opportunity at the very least. Who knows? Maybe the minister and the former minister would welcome the opportunity to provide some clarification about what they knew when or didn't know when or how these processes work. But in any event, I think the proper way of recognizing and respecting the role that officials have is to say that they do critical work implementing government policy, but they are not the ones who are ultimately accountable for the actions of their departments, that responsibility resides with the minister, and that's why we need to hear from the minister. In this particular case, I'll come back to this article that I was referencing earlier about how staff in Minister Mendicino's office knew about Bernardo transfer months before minister did, his office says. So the article reads as follows. Staff in Public Safety, Minister Marco Mendicino's office knew for 3 months that serial killer and rapist Paul Bernardo would be transferred from a maximum security facility to a medium security prison, but didn't inform the minister until after it happened. Staff in this office knew for 3 months. The CBC has learned Correctional Service of Canada said it first emailed Mendicino's office on March 2nd to inform it that Bernardo would be moved to a medium security institution. A final date for the transfer hadn't been determined at that time. CSC said it sent a second email on May 25th to Mendicino's office saying that Bernardo would be transferred 4 days later. The minister's office now says it did not tell Mendicino about Bernardo's transfer until May 30th, the day after the transfer happened. A spokesperson at Mendicino's office would not disclose the names of who in the office knew and would only say multiple members of his staff, I'll underline, multiple, were made aware. The minister's office examined possible options for potentially changing the decision over the subsequent period and were informed that there weren't any, said Press Secretary Audrey Shampoo in a statement to CBC News. The minister was informed of the transfer on May 30th, including details surrounding lack of authority to influence. Mr. Chair, I'll pause there and just observe that we only have the word of the minister's own political staff as the basis for saying that the minister was not informed about this transfer. And in terms of this idea of having senior officials appear before the committee. Of course, typically senior officials would accompany ministers, but it seems that senior officials did inform the minister's office, no doubt with the expectation that staff would inform the minister, and we have the claim, hard claim to swallow on some level, that the minister was not informed. I will note that this is not the first time in which there's critical information that may have been sent to a minister's office, or even there have been past instances we've dealt with the previous Minister for International Development, where information was sent. I actually believe it was where information was sent to his own email, and he said he hadn't checked his own email. And Chair, just thinking about what the minister was doing, he's got a job to do, and that should include being informed about important developments that relate to his portfolio, ensuring that his office is informing him of those developments, and responding to those developments. So, just looking at this, I think this underlines why, if we're going to get to the bottom of the issue of prison transfers, we need to hear from families and their representatives. We need to have them have an opportunity to present. We also need to hear from ministers and not allow this kind of obfuscation of responsibility that we consistently see from members of the government in various instances. So I think this should underline the importance of hearing this information. Now, the article goes on, families kept in the dark, and this is really core to the advocacy we're doing. Is and my biggest concern here is the impact on families and the re-victimization that my colleagues spoke so eloquently about. The article notes a lawyer representing the families of two teenage girls murdered by Bernardo said it's alarming that the minister and the victims' families were kept in the dark for nearly 90 days. If that is true, the staff truly kept this a secret from their boss, then that is an egregious abdication of responsibility and is profoundly unfair to the minister, said Timothy Danson, counsel for the families of Kristen French and Leslie Mahaffey. This is precisely the kind of information that must be communicated with the minister, because the buck stops with the minister. And with that line, the buck stops with the minister, I think we clearly see that Mr. Danson has a precise understanding of how public administration is supposed to unfold in terms of who is responsible for such actions, and a precise understanding, I should say, that I think seems to be lacking on the government side. So these are some of the principal differences, and maybe just one other note in terms of the victims' families. The government motion says one meeting. It lists a fairly large number of people that I think would be difficult to accommodate during one meeting in any event. Our motion doesn't just say Tim Danson. It says representatives of the victims' families, including Tim Danson. So that operative word, including, emphasizes our desire to allow victims' families, their representatives, others that may wish to come forward to be able to be heard, to be able to present their testimony before the committee. Now, Mr. Chair, I did want to move a sub-amendment as well. There was some discussion back and forth about including the Union of Canadian Correctional Officers and hearing their perspective, and that's not in the original motion, but I think that would be a worthwhile addition, and perhaps it will help get support for this amendment. I think when you're talking about security in prisons, when you're talking about whether a particular prisoner is appropriate for maximum security or medium security, I think a perspective from those that are responsible for security operations in prison, I think that perspective should be included in the conversation. So I think that would be a worthwhile change. It was mentioned, so I'm going to propose an amendment that adds in as well. My colleague spoke about the case of another prisoner. Another killer, Nicholas Begg, who was transferred to medium security prison, and I think considering that case in the context of this motion, so that the committee can indeed do a broader look at the issue of these prisoner transfers. As my colleague mentioned, this isn't the first time that this has happened. We've seen a pattern, sadly, from this government of prisoners being transferred, a lack of proper engagement with the families, and re-victimization happening in the process. So I'm going to propose, Mr. Chair, two sub-amendment, a sub-amendment that has two parts. So the first part of the sub-amendment is that after the after the Commissioner of Correctional Service Canada, add, comma, Union of Public Correctional Officers, comma. So that's kind of the first part of that amendment. And then after Tim Danson, add, and representatives of victims of Pickering native Nicholas Begg, who stabbed his 9-month pregnant wife to death, was convicted of murder, given a life sentence, and was transferred to a medium security prison. And so those are the sub-amendments that I will put forward, and I will conclude my remarks at that point. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Would you please direct hard copy, if you could, to the clerk so he can make sure that he's got them correctly? And then they can get them translated properly.
I'll do my best, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. So the debate continues with Mr. Julian on the sub-amendment. So Mr. Julian, followed by Mr. Motz, followed by Madame Michaud. Mr. Julian, please go ahead.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. First, Mr. Jennis has just spoken for half an hour, so quite clearly we are not going to be address the bill. And therefore, I would like to ask that the witnesses who have a very busy and valuable work to do, that they be able to be released and go back to doing their job. I don't think that listening to this filibuster is appropriate, given that they have so many other important things to do.
Is it the will of the committee to proceed thus? Yes? I would like to thank the witnesses and our legislative clerks as well for attending us once again, and I appreciate your patience, all of you. And we will get to you, I promise, someday. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This has been a filibuster that's been going on for a month, and I don't know the cost to Canadians, potentially $100,000 when you think of a month of meetings when we're not considering Bill C-20, the Public Complaints and Review Commission. And that is important legislation that we need to get to. I find it really unfortunate. Now, this is compounded, Mr. Chair, by the fact we've already had agreement offline numerous times. And I find it frustrating that every time there is agreement, the Conservatives simply change the goalposts and impose a new type of motion or amendment rather than coming to the conclusion. This is an important subject. We've agreed that the government's handling last spring was tragic in this regard, in the transfer of Mr. Bernardo. We also agree that we have an important role to play as the Public Safety Committee. But I will say that the government's errors have been compounded by the Conservatives' errors over the last few weeks, where instead of coming to a consensus and moving forward with the study, we continue to come to a new motion or a new amendment at every single meeting. Now, where do we agree? We agree in having the study. And where we left off, Mr. Chair, you'll recall, is that I certainly, and this is a minority parliament, so all parties have to be consulted and agreed to a 3-hour meeting that included a number of those important witnesses, plus the meeting with the Minister of Public Safety that I believe needs to be convened as quickly as possible to come to this committee with the officials from public safety so that we can talk about that public safety issue and a number of other public safety issues. And this Conservative filibuster has been blocking that invitation to get the public safety minister here. It is inconceivable to me, Mr. Chair. You would have Conservatives blocking the public safety minister from coming and testifying on this and other very important issues. So I think, quite frankly, the official opposition has handled this badly over the course of the last few weeks, and I find this unfortunate. Now, we have an amendment and a sub-amendment, which doesn't allow me to move the amendments that I was hoping to do so we could move through and vote on Ms. O'Connell's motion. But the three elements that I wanted to bring were the following. First off, that the 3-hour meeting that we'd all agreed to be that first meeting that we hold on this issue. Secondly, that we convene the Minister of Public Safety with his officials, and that would be a second meeting in this. I'm certainly open to other meetings on this. I've said this numerous times. But when we look at what the Conservatives are attempting to do, I must say, having lived through the Harper regime and having lived through Conservatives steadfastly stopping ministers who had been demoted from their positions coming to committee, I guess we can say that the Conservatives are reflected on that after being steadfastly opposed to bringing ministers who've been demoted as a result of their actions. And the Conservatives are now saying bring that former minister back. I'm not prepared to say yes to that today, but I think it's important that that be something we potentially look at depending on the answers we get from the first two meetings. Mr. Chair, that makes sense to start step by step. The more important element I would like to bring also comes, and this I think was certainly one of the proudest moments that I've seen in terms of all parties working together in committee, whereas the Canadian Heritage hearings around Hockey Canada. We started with one meeting, you'll recall, Mr. Chair, one meeting 15 months ago. And from there, all parties agreed to convene other witnesses. And we made sure as we went through that process with that sporting organization and other national sporting organizations that we move forward on consensus at every single step. We also heard from victims, Mr. Chair. And Conservatives on the Heritage Committee had, I think, the presence of mind to agree with all the parties to ensure that any victims that came forward were done in a way that was trauma-informed. The Heritage Committee undertook that understanding of trauma-informed questioning. We took it forward as a committee. We went through that and then subsequently invited victims. I regret to see that the Conservatives on this committee have not taken that tact, that they need to understand the impact of trauma and that this committee needs to be well versed on what trauma-informed committee hearings could be. And as Ms. Rumpel-Gardner, who I have enormous respect for, mentioned numerous times, these victims have experienced trauma. I don't understand why Conservatives aren't agreeing to a trauma-informed approach on this. So the reality is we already have agreement. We know that we want to have a 3-hour meeting followed by a meeting with the Minister for Public Safety or potentially with the Public Safety Minister appearing before. And then as a committee, we can decide where to go from there. But if at every meeting the demands change, if at every meeting the amendments change, if at every meeting there is a new group of witnesses or a new configuration, we will not be doing the work that we need to do on behalf of Canadians. So through you, Mr. Chair, I say to my Conservative colleagues, you agreed to a 3-hour meeting, you agreed to having the Minister of Public Safety come forward. Let's move forward with that. Let's get to those hearings, and let's decide as a committee after that what the next steps are. I'm certainly open-minded on that. I do believe we need to be going through this legislation that has now been sitting at this committee's desk for months, and given the importance of having that review around CBSA and the RCMP, that the numerous complaints that have come forward, that legislation be modernized and that we put in place the amendments that will improve the legislation, that we have to move to that as quickly as possible. And the cost is not just in the delay of months on the legislation. The cost as well is in the tens of thousands of dollars when we have witnesses from the RCMP and Public Safety and CBSA that come forward at each meeting and are unable to provide their expertise because we're not even going to the legislation. We can have this resolved today if we simply stop the filibuster, allow the vote, allow the additional amendments that bring the Minister of Public Safety forward, that allow for that 3-hour meeting that we all agreed to offline, and that allow for trauma-informed approach with victims. Those are the 3 steps that allow this, this study to move forward and allow us to complete the work on Bill C-20.
Just a point of
And there is no reason why we cannot move forward today.
just a point of clarification, Chair. My colleague, who I was listening intently.
Sorry.
I'm
Go
just
ahead.
wondering if my colleague had proposed a sub-amendment. I was listening intently to him.
He can't.
I cannot because of the sub-amendment and the amendments that are on the table, so I can't.
Okay.
There can only be one sub-amendment alive at one time. However, if we were to vote on that sub-amendment, then there would be capacity to carry it forward.
Yep. No, I've said my piece, Mr. Chair, and I ask my Conservative colleagues to allow for the votes so we can move forward, hopefully with a consensus on this. It's an important issue. It's not something that we should be delaying on. But when we have a consensus offline, we need to bring that to committee.
Mr. Julian, we go now with Mr. Motz, followed by Madame Michaud.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to respond first to my colleague, Mr. Julian's comments about heritage and how that committee worked through a very, again, a very delicate situation. As I see, they're 2 completely separate issues, because in this circumstance, when we're dealing with the security transfer, our security reclassifications of inmates, and the decision to do that and the legislation around it, this government is solely responsible for that legislation and solely responsible for the implementation of that legislation, other than Hockey Canada, who was, who was really the focus of the conversations in the Heritage Committee. So, I think a couple of things that I want to just reinforce with this new amendment, or this new sub-amendment. The amendment to Ms. O'Connell's motion, and there's a couple of thoughts that I want to get to through this process. Mr. Biddle commented that based on the reference to Conservatives playing games on this matter, nothing could be further from the truth. This is not a game. This is about the rights of victims. And he can laugh over there all he wants, Mr. Chair, but I don't know what this government is so afraid of. If we're really talking about dealing with the victims, the rights of victims' families, the specifically on the reclassification of security of our inmates, and this is beyond this specific transfer. There are multiple examples of families being re-victimized again and again and again in the same specific way to this transfer. And this government has a history, quite honestly, of ignoring victims. So, there are serious sentences, life sentences, previously dangerous offenders, those serving their time in maximum security prisons who are now being transferred to medium security prisons. And, quite honestly, it really concerned me when I saw some of the stats that came out from an OPQ, order paper. Thank you, an order paper question with respect to this exact question. There are dangerous offender designated prisoners in our prison system who are serving their time initially in maximum, but now they're in medium security prisons. 580 of them, as a matter of fact. previously designated or currently designated dangerous offenders who are now serving their time in medium security prisons. And there's even over 50 serving their time in minimum security prisons. And we know the freedom of these individuals certainly vary with respect to the level of security in their facility. So now, this has an impact on the families who were victimized the first time around. And as I was going to say earlier, is the Canadians are left to wonder. I mean, we are, the Conservatives, of course, are the bad guys here now, apparently, because we are trying to stand up for a regime of transfers, reclassification, and potential transfers that has a direct impact on families, on victims. And so, why does this government refuse to study? I'm left to wonder. Canadians are wondering, what are they hiding? What are they afraid of finding out? Why would they not want to ensure that the legislation that allows for the transfer and reclassification of security for our prisoners not be examined, re-examined, be tightened up so as not to re-victimize families again? And talking about the victim, the impact that this has on families. From decades in law enforcement, families are victimized over and over and over again in the whole process of criminal justice, as we know. During the original offense, obviously, and the tragedy that occurred, they are victimized there. They have to relive that during the investigation, during the trial, during sentencing. During the preparation of victim impact statements. Then they have to deal with parole hearings and potentially more impact statements. And now we have to, this added burden and traumatization to victims on transfers of reclassifications of prisoners. And we have to deal with, it's not just the transfer that's the issue. It's the lack of communication that correctional services, the minister's office, the Canadians experienced during this process, and such a transfer has to be victim informed. Has to be the impact of that trauma again has to be considered when doing a transfer. And Mr. Chair, I recognize that bells are going to be soon, and I want to give Ms. Michaud an opportunity to speak before bells, and I would ask that I come back when she's done if there's still time before bells. Thank you.
So after Madame Michaud, there is Mr. Jennis, and then I'll put you on the list.
Merci, Monsieur
Madame
le
Michaud,
Président.
allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I find this an extreme pity, and I've said so since the beginning of this debate. For a number of hours, we have been debating this motion or numerous motions along the same lines. The committee has an agenda. We should be debating C20, which is a very important bill. And people have reminded us about the importance of this bill for them. We've received emails. Everybody on this committee has received emails from the victims that have suffered harms from CBSA and deserve that parliamentarians address this issue. So I feel this very disrespectful regarding these people who are turning to the committee, wanting us to get to the bottom of this bill and would like to see a vote here while this other issues being debated. Not that this issue is not important. There are many, many issues that are important for public safety in Canada and that could be debated here. It is the timing that is ill-chosen, if I can say it this way. I think we've already wasted enough time. We should be debating C20. That said, I think that my colleague, Ms. McConnell, has come forth with a reasonable compromise with the motion that's on the floor, and it is the desire of the Conservatives to debate this once C20 is dealt with. And I think the priority of this committee is bills. So we could have debated this even after C26, but we agreed that we could go straight to this after C20. And this motion is reasonable, one which we could all agree on, I believe. So I'm opposed to the amendments and sub-amendments brought forth by the Conservative Party. We have had ample time to discuss and negotiate outside of this committee to not waste the time of numerous people. The Conservatives keep coming back with a new proposal to politicize the debate, and this is deplorable. It is no secret. After all, we're trying to politicize this debate. And I have asked myself the question, should we also politicize this process? Correctional services exist for a purpose. And so why are we bringing the minister into this? I don't understand. And I agree with some of the elements raised by Mr. Julian, and that we release the witnesses after several hours of debate. So out of respect for all those who expect of us that we do our job, I would like us to go ahead, that we vote on the amendments, the sub-amendments, and the motion. We arrive at a consensus, and we move forward with C20, because there are people who are waiting after us for a long time. And I said that there is certain, fault on the part of the Conservatives to be filibustering and spending time on this. But the committee has also spent a lot of time on C21, because the government only more or less did its job well. And now, we've had other bills, but there have been certain provocations and then elections, and that on the part of Liberals. So I see political games being played on both sides. This is a topic that should not be politicized. So I think we should be voting on what we need to vote for. Thank you.
Merci, Madame. Unfortunately, we cannot get to a vote while there are people wishing to speak. Next we have Mr. Jennis, followed by Mr. Motz.
Thank you, Chair. I think Mr. Motz has a few more points he wants to put on the record, but before that, I did want to respond to a couple of the things that were raised. So, in terms of how a committee schedules its agenda, right? I think members understand that when a motion has been put on notice, members can move that motion regardless of the agenda, and I think that's an important provision, because it. In the absence of such a provision, if members were required to confine themselves to the agenda, then a chair could repeatedly schedule issues that were schedule one issue to avoid, let's say, dealing with another issue. And I think knowing that there was a strong desire among committee members to address this issue before we proceeded to C20, the chair could have, let's say, scheduled this meeting as a meeting of committee business, which is in effect what we've ended up discussing anyways. It's simply that that the fact that the officials were invited because the agenda said C20 was maybe, I would suggest, Chair, there was a reality in terms of what this committee needed to discuss. The other just observation I would make, though, is that it was, of course, Ms. O'Connell who moved the motion, right? So it was a decision by the government to move their motion. Of course, our view was that this issue needed to be discussed, that it needed to be discussed with 3 meetings. But this is where we are. We're under the rubric of that discussion, and so we are, I think, in good faith trying to put forward, but also insist on our position. And our core position is that when it comes to this transfer of Paul Bernardo from maximum to medium security, that the families have to be heard on this issue, that the families have to have an opportunity to testify, that ministers have to be held accountable for their actions, that we need a proper investigation, a proper study of this issue. That is our position. That will continue to be our position, that families of victims need to be heard, and we need to hold the government accountable to ensure that this sort of thing doesn't happen again. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Mr. Jennis. Mr. Motz, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair. I would defer mine to the regular amendment and suggest we go ahead and vote on the sub-amendment, please.
Is there any more debate on the sub-amendment? Mr. Julian?
Just very briefly, I'll be voting against the sub-amendment, but with the intention of reintroducing it when we come back to the main motion, Mr. Chair. So just want to be
put you
very
on the
clear
list.
so my vote is not misinterpreted.
Okay. A recorded division, please, Mr. Clerk. On the sub-amendment, yes.
Ms. O'Connell.
No.
Mr. MacDonald. No. Monsieur Schiffke.
No.
Mr. Geir.
Against?
Mr. Biddle. No. Mr. Shipley.
Yes.
Ms. Rempel Gardner.
Yes.
Mr. Melillo.
Yes.
Mr. Matz.
Yes.
Madame Michaud.
Contre.
Mr. Julian.
No, contre.
4 and 7 against.
Thank you. The sub-amendment is defeated. We carry on with the motion as amended by Ms. Rempel-Garner, and we go to Mr. Julian. I believe you want... I'm sorry?
Point of order, Chair. I think you mean the amendment, not the motion as amended. We're on the amendment.
Correct. Thank you for the clarification. We go to the amendment, Ms. Rempel-Garner's amendment to Ms. O'Connell's motion. So, Mr. Julian, I believe you wanted the floor following.
Just again, very briefly, Mr. Chair, what I'm hoping to do after I'll be voting against the amendment, though there are some elements that I would like to bring back to Ms. O'Connell's motion. First off, that we hold a 3-hour meeting. Secondly, that the Minister of Public Safety be invited as soon as possible to come to committee on public safety issues. And then thirdly, that we receive a briefing on trauma-informed committee hearings. So that this committee will be as well informed as the Canadian Heritage Committee was, if in the future we are looking to have victims come forward. I also would be proposing at that time that the Union of Public Correctional Officers be brought in. I thought that was a helpful proposal from the Conservatives. So I'll be voting against the amendment, but with the intention of proposing some amendments. Now, Mr. Chair, I believe we're going to have bells very, very shortly, so we may not get to that today, but I'm hoping offline we can finally come to a consensus so that we can then move on to Bill C-20. A little bit like Madame Michaud, I'm anxious to improve the legislation, and hopefully we can do that at our next meeting.
So, are you moving that sub-amendment at this time?
No, because that would just make it too confusing.
Okay.
So
fair
I
enough.
will be voting against the amendment, and then I will be offering those amendments to Ms.
Very well,
O'Connell's
thank you.
helpful motion.
And I see that we do have bells. So we do require unanimous consent to continue. Do we have unanimous consent to continue?
Say it louder,
Do we have unanimous consent?
No, this might be consent.
Seeing no
You want me
unanimous
to be
consent.
quieter, or now you want me to be louder, Chris?
Seeing no unanimous consent, the committee will stand adjourned at this time.